Hello, everyone, and welcome to the HODLCast. Today we have very special guest, Amber Scott, CEO of Outlier Compliance. Amber, thank you so much for taking the time out today to speak with us about, all things Canadian compliance related, which is pretty topical at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think it's a difficult topic. Canadians aren't usually this over-the-top exciting as we are right now. So I will try my best to answer questions and diffuse some of the FUD that's out there.
Sounds good. Well, first off, can you just give a little background about yourself, how you got involved in the crypto space and what your role is like as a compliance, professional in the Canadian landscape?
Sure. I always say that the shorthand for what Outlier does is that we try to keep people out of trouble, specifically in the space of anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, privacy, and regulatory compliance. We've been working in the crypto space and accepting payments in Bitcoin since 2013. Please don't be all that impressed by this. If you're hearing me say that for the first time, it's not because I had any prescience. It's because someone asked me to update a risk assessment, and it involved Bitcoin, and I had at the time just read about it in Wired. And so for me to understand something, I have to be able to have my hands on it and play with it and be forced to transact in it. And that was the beginning of my love affair with Bitcoin. And I'm lucky to be surrounded by a staff that's also very enthusiastic about the space.
Oh, that's awesome. And I know we met at a conference in Texas many years ago, and you've been on probably four years ago now, 2018, I think it was. And I've had you on as a guest 2 other times. So glad to have you back again. And I always find you're one of the, most knowledgeable people I've ever spoken with on not only the Canadian laws, but you also are very well versed in the U.S. regulations as well. So I'm excited to speak with you about this today.
Thank you.
So what have you seen in the last, say 2 or 3 years in the Canadian crypto environment? Like, how has it grown, and what kind of businesses are you finding you're working with more so these days?
So there's been a big evolution in the last few years. Dealers in virtual currency are regulated as money services businesses. And since 2021, we're actually seeing a lot of businesses now starting to be regulated as well if they're doing custody as securities dealers. So we still have some companies that will only ever just be money, or I shouldn't say only ever, but for now are money service businesses. And that's the only designation that applies, that are doing non-custodial services, so over-the-counter trading desks, Bitcoin ATMs, and those type of businesses. And then as soon as there's a custodial aspect, so custody of crypto specifically, then securities regulators have become involved. And that's been a really interesting path, in that there's a lot more that you have to do as a securities dealer than what you would have to do as a money service business, in terms of insurance, in terms of audited financial statements, in terms of other regulatory compliance. So a lot of businesses are figuring out how to do that. We have seen, unfortunately, there's been some U.S. companies that I'd love to see do business here that have said, we're going to wait and see how this goes with the securities regime, because it all is very new. And so right now, for companies that are on that path, it really takes interaction with a securities lawyer, because the securities legislation wasn't written with crypto assets in mind at all. And so there are things in those national instruments that you can't really comply with. And so in order to be regulated as a securities dealer at this point, you need to understand what's being asked of you and to be able to ask for appropriate exemptions to those requirements.
Mm-hmm. And did that come about like when I think it was 3IQ that got one of the first ETFs going? Is that what kind of got the ball rolling with the
I think that the truth of it is a little bit more sinister than that. 3iQ did a fabulous job. They were already a securities dealer. And they wanted to offer the Bitcoin fund, and the Ontario's Securities Commission had said, no, you can't offer this to retail. And 3iQ and the law firm representing them, which was Osler, which is one of my favorite law firms in Canada. They're phenomenal. Just did a really great job. I don't want to say beating up the OSC, but essentially bringing the case before a court to say, no, it makes sense to be able to offer this fund to retail investors. And that was really the argument, that you shouldn't have to be an accredited investor, that there could be appropriate safeguards in place. And now we have a number of different Bitcoin funds, Ethereum funds. We have ETFs. So I think that's one of the places where Canada has done a really great job.
I agree. Yeah, but when you said it's a little more sinister of why they gave the dual.
Why do we have custodial exchanges that are regulated? I think that's a little bit more of a knock-on effect of situations like the Quadriga meltdown, where specifically there was the idea that if you're custodying these assets and these assets aren't, just something that's being used to make a payment or do an over-the-counter trade, but you're holding these assets long-term on behalf of retail investors, there has to be some type of protection for the retail investor. And I think that was the approach that the Canadian securities regulators took, as they looked at it and said, well, these crypto assets are being offered not through funds and not through securities dealers like 3iQ, but they're just being offered to retail investors in a way where they're actually being custodied by the companies that are offering them, and there's not oversight over those things. So if somebody is holding on to these assets on behalf of customers, is there something that we can do to bring them under the auspices of that regime?
And I mean, the Quadriga thing was quite a fiasco a couple years ago, and we've seen people get burned over and over on crypto exchanges. So it's not your keys, not your coins. And I guess if someone is holding millions or billions of dollars of centralized crypto, maybe it's not the worst thing that they have to undergo dual registration there. But I know a lot of people. This is the
argument that they put forward is that if if I'm holding your crypto and what you see is like a balance on a screen that's not something on the blockchain, like really what I'm giving you is a promissory note. It's something that has a lot more resemblance to a security that's held on your behalf than it does to something that you're self-custodying. And this is why there's that differentiation between the services that offer immediate delivery of the crypto and the services that don't.
Well, that's a great overview for what's happening now. So can you give us kind of a little overview of what is going on with the Freedom Convoy? And we heard initially of the funds being, frozen from different various crowdfunding sites. And can you give us a little background on what's happening there?
Yeah, so I think that's been interesting as it developed, and I think this is something that we're still seeing developing. There is a lot of misinformation. So in so much as it's possible for people, I would say, take a look at source documents, take a look at the actual publications in terms of what the orders are. They're out there. This is a fun annotated version that I will refer to if you wonder what the paper flipping sound is. That's me being old school in my note taking. But initially there was fundraising that was done, and it was done via, traditional fiat crowdfunding platforms. The crowdfunding platform initially, I think, was GoFundMe. And my understanding is that there was outreach from law enforcement and from different parties, and GoFundMe made the decision to just return the funds and refund the donors. I think that that's sort of an important part of this story, because there's all of this different narrative that they had seized the funds, that that the funds were directed somewhere else, but that's not what happened. What happened is that the money was refunded to the donors, and so people who donated to that got the money back. Another fiat-based crowdfunding platform had stepped up, and like there was a very well publicized fundraising campaign on that platform. Similar occurrence in terms of they were told, hey, you have to freeze the funds and you can't distribute the funds. There was a Bitcoin fundraising effort that had happened that had raised a phenomenal amount of funds as well. And that brings us to where we stand today, which is that Canada has enacted the Emergency Measures Act. So this is where I'm saying it's important to look at source and what's actually there, because the regulations under the Emergency Measures Act were published. They're online. They're viewable by anyone. They were published at 9:30 last night. So up until that point, there was a lot of statements from government and everybody scrambling, trying to figure out what that meant and what we all actually had to do. And I think there's still going to be more clarity about that in the coming days. There are a lot of questions in terms of whether or not the Emergency Measures Act should have been enacted. I think there are checks and balances in place around that, so it'll be interesting to see how that piece plays out. My running joke on that is that is beyond my pay grade. But I do think that there are folks that are looking at that from various angles. In the meantime, for those of us that are running businesses that are affected by this, I think that it's really important to understand the text of what these regulations are saying and what the intent is. One of the things that I will say at the outset is that the idea is that these measures are temporary. And so
how long are they in place
days.
for? 30 days, okay.
Yeah, 30 days. And I imagine that there are mechanisms to extend that if they need to be extended. I'm going to assume that everybody hopes that that's not the case. In that these are pretty extraordinary measures, and they're measures that we haven't seen in Canada for a long time. So the Emergency Measures Act was previously called the War Act, to give you a sense of the gravity of these type of measures and the unusualness of these type of measures. I mean, it's been a generation since we've seen anything like this. So I think there are definitely a lot of legal scholars that are scrambling as to the meaning and the gravitas of the thing.
What are some of the key measures that are written in there?
Yeah, so one of the first things that I want to say in terms of what they talk about in the proclamation, they don't talk about protests, and I think that's an important distinction. They do talk about the continuing blockades. So they're talking about blockades of motor vehicles and individuals that are blocking things like critical infrastructure, that are blocking access to international bridges. So there is, I think, a distinction between I am stopping traffic from crossing at an international border crossing, and I am standing in front of the Parliament building with a sign. And I think that needs to be clear just in terms of what they're talking about and the gravitas of those actions. And they talk about, adverse effects to the Canadian economy, breakdown of supply chain, potential for an increase in the levels of unrest and violence. And so this is sort of in the proclamation of why are these extraordinary measures being enacted.
Has there been any violence so far in this Freedom Convoy?
I don't have an exact statistic on that, and so it's difficult to comment. There's been some footage of various things, and I think in a situation like this, it gets very difficult to fact check. And so there are things like footage that is allegedly a couple of individuals, and it looks like they're trying to set fire to a building in Ottawa, and they've taped the door, and fortunately the fire gets put out. I think there's been skirmishes. I have to preface, Canada, generally speaking, is like a different beast in terms of violence. Maybe beyond bar fights in Northern Ontario where I grew up. It's not acts of mass violence, riots, things like that would be really shocking here. It's not part of our culture. It's not part of our DNA. And it's not something that we've seen. At one of the blockades in Alberta, there's a lot of images that the police have published of a number of weapons that were seized. So I think that when we talk about the potential for violence versus actual violence, have we seen, I don't want to call them like U.S. style violence, but I think the U.S. has seen some very violent, things that started off as protest actions that became more like violent riot type of actions.
Oh yeah, I was living
and we haven't seen that.
During those George Floyd riots, we moved in the middle of it, we moved to Florida because it was just getting crazy. But yeah, it was as a Canadian, it was I know it's a lot different of a culture of, what happens at those. And even a lot of people thought that it was, possibly being the people doing the violence were wearing, distinct outfits that maybe they were being paid to incite violence, or I don't know. It's a whole weird thing of like who's instigating the violence. But
yeah, there are a lot of different theories about what those factions might be. I think whenever there is a big gathering, there's the potential for that, and there's the potential for the type of person who maybe isn't part of the core action that will just show up because
get in there
because it gives them the cover to just be an asshole essentially, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the core of what that action or what that protest might be about. But that doesn't change the potential for that thing.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at what the government has said in media, they're very they're very, very careful not to say protest. So that's not the characterization that they're giving this action. But the word blockade comes up again and again and again. So blockade comes up in the regulation related to the Emergency Measures Act. It comes up in what the Prime Minister has said. It comes up what the Minister of Finance has said. It comes up in Public Safety Canada's publication about it. And so I think that's one of the things to be very cognizant of, is that characterization and the pieces of it that are actually at issue. Now, we get into a really interesting thing in that I think it's really hard to separate at this point the difference between protest versus blockade. And so unfortunately, when you're a bank, if you're a money service business, if you're any type of regulated business, and that's going to include Bitcoin exchanges, you can't transmit funds to any of these things at this point in time. I think there may be some future point where maybe the protests, there are protests that aren't doing the things that are at issue, where maybe we'll see some of those funds freed up. Maybe we'll see those funds returned to donors. But for now, we're in a situation where the requirement is really that those are frozen. And frozen doesn't mean seized. So there, and I have to make that clear. So we're not talking about, again, a situation where at this point there's any type of civil asset forfeiture. So it's not, the government is not taking money and saying you can never have it back. If I were a betting person, I think a far more likely outcome is that we're going to see things like what happened with GoFundMe, where the answer is that gets returned to donors to the extent that it's possible to do so. I do think that in cases where, where things get distributed, sometimes people are putting themselves in pretty actionable positions, just in terms of there potentially being charges. And those are actually pretty sweeping. And it was interesting to me, the types of things that are in there as potentially separate offenses when you look at the way that the regulations are written. So there's a prohibition, not against all public assembly, But talking about anything, so if there's a serious disruption to the movement of persons or goods, or a serious interference with trade, so again, there we're talking about things like the blockading of the international bridges, blockading of any access to critical infrastructure, and that's the second point, is interference with the functioning of critical infrastructure. And they give a very clear, here's 6 points of what critical infrastructure is. So we're talking about things like airports, hospitals, utilities, power generation, trade corridors. So it's pretty well defined here in terms of what's not to be disrupted. And the idea that is that there's a prohibition against assembly that's intended to disrupt those things. And the final point of that is the support or threat of use of acts of serious violence against persons or property. And I think the concept of violence against property gets interesting in that that's one of the things that there has been some footage of. Although again, it's not like we've seen a lot of like bricks through the windows of local businesses and things that have happened in other contexts, in so much as just kind of shocking and icky footage of the desecration of a war monument, and those types of things that didn't, to me, in terms of what I saw, look like permanent damage, but still not something that sat well. Now there's a separate offense. So you must not cause a person under the years of 18 years of age to participate, which is to say that you're part of a blockade, there's one offense. You brought your child, there's a second offense added onto it, because you're causing that person who's a minor to participate. Well,
I guess we know where that one comes from, like all of what happened in Kenosha, But a lot of people, I think, got upset by that under 18 thing, saying, I want to bring my family. And they had like bouncy houses at the Ottawa downtown area where everyone's like the footage I've seen is of people like dancing. And, it looks like kind of a fun time. But I guess they're saying it's different at the blockade of the bridge versus the Parliament building.
And I think you get into some different things even in Ottawa. So I have a lot of empathy for folks that live in those neighborhoods, and in some cases are afraid to leave their houses or have a baby that hasn't slept in days because there is constant horn honking, and those things seem minor compared to things like bricks through a window or gun violence, but I think they're still very unpleasant for the people that are there and dealing with them. So it's interesting to see the way that those things play out. And if you have people that are essentially not able to leave their own neighborhood in a meaningful way, then that's, you get into how much are you disrupting these people's access to critical infrastructure, if that's been a constant in their lives. And this isn't AML specific, but I think there's also something that's fascinatingly classist that happens with things like that, in that were it my neighborhood, I would probably pack up my dogs and my cat and my partner and be somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
But not everyone has that option.
Yeah, very true. Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting as we continue into these things happening. But I'm gonna just jump, if I can, to the financial services measures that are in here. So we talk about one of the definitions is a designated person. So they define that as any entity or individual that's engaged directly or indirectly in any of the prohibited activities that are discussed. And the obligation then is to cease dealing. So not dealing in property, not facilitating any transactions, not making available property, including funds and virtual currency, not providing related financial services. And this gets really interesting to me because there's also the inclusion of insurance. So there's the idea that, let's say my insurance company dumped me because I'm part of this blockade, which is a thing that, as I understand it, has happened in a couple of cases. There's like a prohibition against a new insurance company insuring you while you're doing this activity.
Well, insurance companies have all kinds of they have all kinds of weird rules of like when they'll pay out. So that it surprised me at first, but it's like it's a weird industry for all of their exclusions and weird exceptions. Yeah.
Oh yeah, like if you're participating in a riot, your life insurance probably doesn't cover you.
Not to pay out, like, oh well, you were at the blockade or you were suspected at this one thing. No payment for you. Yeah, I even saw one supporter of all this measure saying that people who are participating in it shouldn't be allowed to own stocks in companies anymore. The companies should have a right to choose who their stockholders are based on their, views. And so it's like, oh my God, what kind of world are we getting to?
I think we're going to end up with some really interesting lawsuits when this all winds down. Some of the pieces I've seen now, it's hard to tell how much is really substantiated, and I think something would have to work its way through a court or a tribunal. But there have been reports of people losing their employment because they've been part of these leaked donor lists, and I think that's one of the things that if that is the case, and that's the sole reason that person lost their employment, they've probably got a decent case and should probably seek some legal advice on that, particularly if they were donating to something before there were any of these emergency measures acts.
Yeah, because there wouldn't have been any notice to them that this was a problem. And
exactly.
It sounds almost like they've just created an OFAC list, in Canada, but I think the criteria of getting on an OFAC list is possibly quite a bit higher than the bar here of like what makes someone a problem in this. Is it that they're out with a sign and their family in a bouncy house saying we don't support vaccine, forced medicine on people, or is it only the people that are blocking traffic and blocking the bridge? So that distinction.
And this is something that I think gets really interesting that industry is struggling with. The other piece is that when you're talking about individuals, you're right. There is a pretty high standard in generally having someone listed as an individual. There's the idea that there is some sort of crime, that there is strong enough evidence of that. And so this becomes interesting. I think with the donation platforms, there's a pretty easy argument to say, well, we can't say that this funding won't go to a blockade, and so we're asking that be frozen for the time being. And I think with individual accounts, it gets a lot more difficult. There's also the circumstances under which you're able to exchange personal information or not. And so I think this gets particularly interesting in that when you're talking about fundraising, for instance, law enforcement can circulate a list of virtual currency addresses and say, we think these virtual currency addresses are problematic. And there's no personal information there. This is a really powerful tool that I think we all in the crypto industry love when it's related to something like a scam. So, if you can say, hey, I've been scammed and this is the scammer's address, and keep an eye on this address, and you can do that without exchanging any personal information, that's such a cool and powerful tool. And tools that work really well in situations that we're in favor of also work really well in situations that we might be less in favor of. And so I think this is uncomfortable for a lot of the exchanges right now as they figure out, what their responsibility is.
Like how many hops from, so they was it 34 Bitcoin addresses or like one ETH and one Cardano address so far? At least that's what I saw on Twitter. I don't know if that's verified, but They took some Bitcoin addresses and said you can't transact with those. But how many? Okay, what if the person goes to a coin join? Then can the exchange transact with it, or does the exchange have to say, oh, actually, we don't want to work with anyone that's come from a coin join in case they are one of these people, or like where does that line fall?
I think it's really a case by case basis, and it depends on the exchange's risk tolerance. You'll have and the tools that they have at their disposal. But that's something that you're generally seeing already, where when I send something, to an exchange, they're assessing where that's coming from. They're using those analytics tools. They're looking at it to see that this isn't coming from a theft or a hack or ransomware and those type of things. And so this becomes another layer. And the idea is at this point, if they make the determination, so if the exchange says within reason, I think that's what this is, then you get into a case where the exchange has an obligation to report and they have an obligation to freeze those assets. And I don't know what will happen to those assets at the point of freezing. So this is where I say I think eventually the answer will be returned to sender, but in the interim we're dealing with these. Well, now we have to freeze this, and none of us are really sure how long we have to freeze it for, what happens to it, or what we do with it.
And so what happens, like, so say they do go as far as saying, like, okay, the government goes as far to say we're going to implement civil asset forfeiture procedures here. How would they do that? Like, how hard would it be for them to go to that measure?
I think civil asset forfeiture procedures would actually be really difficult, because what you're talking about usually in a case of civil asset forfeiture is that you're dealing with proceeds of crime. So usually the answer to that is that the onus is on the agency doing the civil asset forfeiture, so the police and the Crown, to show that the asset that they're seizing on the balance of probabilities, so it's a different standard, it's not beyond a reasonable doubt, it's balance of probabilities, so yeah, that probably came from crime. And I don't think you can do that in a meaningful way in this case, because what you very clearly have is that there was a fundraiser, and at the time of the fundraiser, people think they're donating funds, that's related to legal protest activity. And so, like I said, at least until the point where there's been that emergency order, or possibly if there are things where they can show, yes, this is specifically related to a blockade, as opposed to protest activity. And I haven't done a detailed academic review, of all of the fundraising pages.
24 hours.
Yeah, and like what all of the fundraising pages are saying. But I'm going to go ahead and make an educated guess that there weren't, to a significant extent, fundraising pages that said, yes, let's block bridges and interrupt trade and incite violence. I don't think that was there. I think mostly what these talked about was within the context of supporting what was believed to be a legal, peaceful protest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. I think now that I'm talking with you, I'm feeling a little bit more calm about it, actually, that it's not that every person that's there in Ottawa with a sign is the target of this thing, that it's more just targeted at blockades. But it still seems like, in my opinion, the easier way would be to just, get rid of some of these harsh or cruel mandates and let everyone go home and get on with their lives, rather than going to this extent with it. But that's, So, and this is sort of the interesting thing that's happened across the country in the interim, is that a lot of those things are provincial matters. So there's a lot of those mandates that aren't even federal matters. And on a provincial basis,
you're seeing a lifting of all, and we were seeing a lifting of a lot of these mandates before the beginning of the protests. There's a statistic from university sociology that I'm probably going to misquote the heck out of right now, but it's always stuck with me, and that it's that prison riots are always more common at a point in time where conditions in the prison system are improving.
I wonder why that is.
That seems really counterintuitive. I don't know why that is either. There was a bunch of theories. I don't remember any of the theories, and I think none of them made sense to me. But I remember that stat really clearly as being like, there's something really fascinating and counterintuitive about that. And I think we are at a point where a lot of the mandates are being lifted. The conversation around things is shifting. I think I read recently that we're at a 90% vaccination rate. So there's all of these really interesting factors. But I think if I were to look at it, I hope that we don't need these emergency measures for 30 days. My sincere hope is that there is a serious analysis on the part of people who are organizing protests, who are leading this type of activity, to say, okay, let's not do the problematic illegal things. Let's make sure that there is access to infrastructure. Let's make sure that we're not blockading bridges or cutting off access to critical infrastructure. And let's be reasonable and withdraw from these areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And obviously I'm not there. I'm finding it so hard to understand what the truth is. Like, I feel like the news these days has been just corrupted on both sides, that you get these extreme point of views, and sometimes I go down these dark rabbit holes where I start, but then you realize it's like, oh, that's not actually true. Like in the morning after, my 2 a.m. telegram, binges on these articles, and so, these random news sites that have popped up now. So I saw one picture of a bunch of phones saying, okay, here's a blockade. They put a bunch of phones on a bridge, and, Google Maps shows that the bridge is, blocked. But I believe the bridge really was blocked there. But it is pretty scary, all the things you can do with technology now, like just by putting 100 phones on a bridge, a place can report, oh, this bridge is currently being blocked because, all the phones there show congestion. So it's just weird what they can do with technology. But also one of the things, who sponsored all this money too? Like, where did it come from? I heard there was some stat that a lot of it came from outside Canada. And I think my own personal view is probably a lot of people have been watching Canada in horror over the last year with all these, like, it's kind of like Australia, like it just really, harsh lockdowns compared to a lot of other places in the year. And I think a lot of people were just like, hey, good for you guys, getting together and trying to fight back on this. But I heard other news, places saying like, oh, it's, just questioning, why is this money coming from outside the country? And that could be part of what's made the government like very nervous of it. And
I think we won't know that until there's been a better post hoc forensic analysis. I think that it's something that we've seen in the politics of every country in recent years to an uncomfortable extent, where there are outside influences, so influences from outside the country, your country, my country, every country that I'm aware of, that are really attempting to sow dissent and destabilize. And so, do I think on the part of the government that there's a fear that that's occurring? Absolutely. Is that what's occurring? I don't know. That is probably a question for CSIS or the RCMP. And certainly not something that I, as a lowly AML geek, would have access to. But I'm open to the possibility that that's part of the threat model that they're responding to, and part of why this might seem really harsh and horrifying to me, because I don't necessarily understand the whole picture.
Mm-hmm. So in general, what is like a suspicious activity in on an exchange, or like how does a crypto company deem something suspicious, and what does this new act, how does that change what people's consideration of a suspicious activity report or the trigger to file one?
Yeah, so I mean, normally the threshold for a suspicious activity report is really low. So it's that you'd have reasonable grounds to suspect that a transaction is related to any sort of money laundering or terrorist financing offense, or any sort of underlying criminal offense. So, fraud, theft, so anything where you think this financial transaction is somehow related to a crime. You don't have to know what the crime is. It's enough that you look at it and it just doesn't make sense. And the threshold in Canada is a little bit different than in the US in that we don't have a de minimis exemption. So there's no dollar value at which this isn't reportable if you're a reporting entity. Like I could come in and do a $10 transaction and be like, I want to buy $10 worth in Bitcoin because I need to go get some Rohypnol from the dark web. Reportable. Because there's just like, there's no dollar threshold. In fact, in that scenario, if you say, you know what, I'm not going to sell you any Bitcoin, you're shady, please leave. That is still reportable as an attempted suspicious transaction. So that's, I think, really important context when we look at it and say then, okay, is the activity related to a blockade? So if it's related to any of these addresses that have been posted publicly, that is related to fundraising, I think you're in reportable territory. I think you're in duty to freeze territory. If
how would you know if it's for a blockade unless someone comes in and says, "Hey, I was using this money as part of the Freedom Convoy blockade"? No one's really going to say that. So then you've got to make a decision of
you say that you say that, and yet no, I think one of the things that's happened and where people have been turned away in terms of transactions is that as the emergency measures came out and there was uncertainty around it, one of the things that happened is that there were cases where people came and said like, hey, we'd like to do this transaction, but we're not sure if you're going to be comfortable with it. So we'd like to cash out or like we'd like to do various things. And I think that's a really interesting thing, particularly within the crypto community, is there's like sometimes a lot of information disclosure and a lot of fraternity. So the idea that they want to be clear about what they're doing, and they want to do those transactions with someone who's going to be comfortable with that transaction. I'm not saying that that's the case all of the time, but a couple of those situations have definitely come up.
And what about for non-custodial solutions? Like I think this is almost like a push, towards that for anyone that wants to not have the risk of their money getting frozen for, the suspicion that they might be partaking in a something like a blockade. If they're using non-custodial wallets, there's really no way, to me it seems like all crowdfunding should always be done, just a straight Bitcoin address and no one can ever touch it or mess with it. So
this is one of the interesting things that's come up in the Emergency Measures Act and the regulations around it, is they've actually said, so crowdfunding platforms, including platforms that are set up to raise virtual currency, now have a duty in this regard, where crowdfunding platforms they're not usually covered as money services businesses. But if you're setting up some sort of website or platform for the purpose of crowdfunding, then you would now be covered. And this is this part where
So your web
crowdfunding
hosting
platforms don't
turned
usually
off.
have to register with FinTrack, but certainly for the next 30 days they do. Similarly, payment service providers that provide payment services to crowdfunding platforms. So that piece of it is fascinating, because I think if you're a crowdfunding platform that you're scrambling to figure this out at this point, there's now a registration to open on FinTrack's website. There's reporting that's starting to open up and be available to them, and there's an expectation to report. But these aren't platforms that have had to report historically. So I imagine there's a big scramble to just figure out, are we dealing with funds that we need to be concerned about, and what do we do, and conversations happening with CSIS and the RCMP to say, okay, we've frozen the funds. Like, what do we do at this point, and what do we tell people at this point? And I think that's happening with all financial institutions. So I don't think this is a crypto specific issue. I think any of the entity types that are covered here are dealing with that. And then from a payment service provider perspective, there's, do you provide services to crowdfunding platforms, or like to anything that could be used in this way? So there's really a nuanced analysis that has to happen about, could we have touched this type of transaction, and then what happened?
Mm-hmm. And the worst, well, I don't want to, a lot of times when new regulations and stuff come out, what I've seen is people get scared of it and then they over comply, or like they do too much, like they don't want to risk their own business getting shut down or being seen in a negative light, so they go much further than they need to with some of their measures too. So maybe that's like websites that are hosting the crowdfunding, or like Amazon Web Services could eventually just say, oh, we're not going to put your site on the internet, or it could get really, this could reach further, I guess, than just, the crowdfunding itself, when the way it sounds like it's written.
And I hope that we don't get to this point. And this is where I say, like, I am very much fingers crossed that this situation will resolve itself, and that people will collaborate and stop doing the things that are the bridge blockades and things like that, and sort of just remove the source of what's perceived as the necessity of the Emergency Measures Act. But you're right. I do think in the interim we're going to see institutions take a pretty conservative view on some of these things. Where I'm worried most about that is the piece that you mentioned, in terms of, if there's an individual that's been on, in Ottawa at protests, and on social media and vocal about that, what does that look like? And I think there's a lot of discussion about that, because there's unpleasant consequences. So if you freeze an individual's bank account, you're dealing with someone that is missing rent payments and mortgage payments, and needs to buy food and needs to access the necessities of life. And I don't think that's the intent of any of this. The intent isn't that it's going to harm a Canadian whose intention was just to attend a peaceful protest or donate to a peaceful protest. So I think that we do need to be cautious in that regard, and at the same time, if you're a regulated entity, and if you're an entity that's covered by this act and by these requirements, regardless of your personal political views, you do have to think about the impact to your business. You do have to think about what that means from a long-term perspective. And so it's a balancing act.
Does it have fines for non-compliance?
It does. So the penalties range from there's both the possibility of there being a fine. So there's two paths. So there's summary conviction, or There is indictment, so not so serious and quite serious. And so for the summary conviction, it's a fine not exceeding $500 or imprisonment not exceeding 6 months or both. And then for indictment, it's a fine not exceeding $5,000 or imprisonment not to exceed 5 years or both. So, yeah, I mean, there is I think the possibility for that to be pretty serious. I think there's, for most people, a $500 fine isn't life ruining. But
having if your bank account so I think what the fear on Twitter is that like, oh, if you're deemed someone that was maybe just attending the protest, then your bank is going to freeze all your assets and you're never going to be able to transact. Like if you're using custodial crypto services, you're not going to be able to move it into your bank account ever, so you can't get it off those platforms. You've lost your Bitcoin, you've lost your bank account, you're probably going to lose your family and starve to death, all because of this. No one wants that. That's what it looks like. But I think as we've talked it through, it's much narrower of a scope than that.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. I don't think that, other than in the most egregious of cases, we're going to see anything that looks like civil asset forfeiture. I think for the most part we'll see freezing orders. So I do think we're going to see funds that are frozen. We're going to see crypto that's being frozen. I expect that will be temporary, and I expect that for the most part we're going to see essentially a return to sender type pattern.
Mm-hmm. And that's how it is here. I even lost my bank account, my law firm's bank account a couple years ago. Due to like they have the Operation Choke Point, which was supposedly ended in 2018, but they just wouldn't offer services to certain type of industries, crypto being one of them, or payment processors. There were about 18 industries, but they return the money. They give you a 30-day notice and they say, get your money somewhere else. But it's not like, oh, we're keeping the money, thanks. And I think that's what, from the comments in general that I saw on Twitter, it was like, and we don't know exactly. I don't think there has been, clarity written of, as you mentioned, what does happen to it. But most likely it's going to go back the same way that the GoFundMe money is just given back to the person that sent it. Or if the bank deems the person too high risk, then they're going to have to say, take your money elsewhere. But it's not going to be like, that they keep the money themselves, unless it is a really egregious thing where they have found that person is interfering with the core infrastructures.
This is exactly it. There just aren't grounds to do that. And I think there's probably worth mentioning a difference in terms of what you're entitled to as an individual versus as a business. Because as a business, like, there's no rights in the Canadian context in terms of access to banking. But as an individual, you have a right to access basic services. And it's just understood you need to have access to a basic banking services to reasonably exist within our society. And so unless the bank thinks that you are doing something illegal at that point in time, so they can say to me like, you know what, this looks like a fraudulent check. We're not going to open a deposit account for you to commit check fraud. Thank you. Bye. They don't have to give me that. Or they can close my account in which I've done check fraud and been caught doing check fraud and it's been problematic. But the next day when I come in with like a legitimate check, then an account gets opened as an individual. And that's, I think, important to note. We also have some very specific rules around the cashing of government checks. So specifically around, payments that are related to disability or any social welfare programs where there are required services related to that. And so if I'm coming in with a disability check, the bank can't refuse to cash that for me unless it's fraudulent or they have, reasons to.
So where this is
believe
probably
that it's
going to apply is
fraudulent.
if you come in with your government check and say, hey, I want to send this to the Freedom Convoy.
Yeah, they're not required to do that. That's not a basic banking
then
service.
They might say, they'll still cash it, but they won't send it for you. That's, I think, where the line is. But just the emergency measures and everything does make it sound really, creepy and possibly really far-reaching. But it sounds like it is a little more manageable.
Yeah, and I don't think the intent here is that the account of anyone who's ever made a donation would be frozen, as much as the accounts that are related to blockades, the accounts that are related to raising money for the blockades would be frozen. Mm-hmm. And like those aren't the same thing.
How do you distinguish them, or how is a bank supposed to distinguish that reasonably?
And that's difficult, and we know that people tend to commingle accounts and use personal accounts for various things, and so we may end up having some awkward cases, but I think an individual has a lot of leverage in terms of saying, no, I need my account to work for these purposes. Even thinking about times where accounts were legitimately frozen. I remember being on vacation with Jonathan in New Orleans where he got pickpocketed, right? And so we're out and he's like, oh, that was my, it was my bank card, my Visa, and all these things. And just going through and shutting down accounts. And then we were using my cards that aren't connected to him. But then like calling our bank and saying, yeah, we need you to shut down our account so that nothing happens. And if you can bounce everything except our mortgage payment, can you just let our mortgage payment happen? And like everyone else will will deal with their stuff later. So it was a really fascinating process, but like there's a lot that you can do in terms of having that conversation with your bank as an individual. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, this has been really fascinating, and I think helpful to understand the limits of this, and that it's not as far-reaching as what the Twitter headlines make it look like. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about it, Amber. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
All right. Is there any parting words you want to give anyone about how to comply with this if they are a Canadian company that's impacted by it?
I think always like take a deep breath, stay calm, talk to your lawyers, talk to your advisors. Don't make rash decisions about it. I know that we all have a tendency to be feisty, but think about yourself and your business in the long term.
Very nice. And where can people find you?
OutlierCanada.com and at Outlier Canada on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.